Today, we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 26, how Paul, the Apostle Paul, is before Festus, Agrippa, Bernice, in this place called Caesarea in an amphitheater, and he is giving a defense. Not just a defense, but a holistic defense. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, the Apostle Peter says, "Sanctify the Lord your God. Always be prepared to give an answer to the hope that you have with gentleness and meekness." What kind of a defense is that? Paul here will give a defense as far as his own faith. He'll give a personal defense. He'll give an existential defense. He'll give a rational defense. He'll give a biblical defense. And last, he'll give a selfless defense that we can all use in our everyday lives.
We believe when you know Jesus Christ, everything changes. Daily Church helps people grow daily in their relationship with God. Welcome to daily.church.
Before we get to Acts chapter 26, question, how do we get here? Well, the Apostle Paul has experienced three different trials, and this is his third one. Well, the first one is in Acts chapter 23, where he is in a prison in Jerusalem. And as he's in prison in Jerusalem, Jesus appears to him in Acts chapter 23, verse 11, and says this to him. The following night, the Lord stood by himself and says, "Take courage, for you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify also in Rome." Okay? Now, this is Acts chapter 23, verse 11. We assume when God says something, it's going to happen the next day. It might happen the next week. This did not happen as far as Paul going from Jerusalem all the way to Rome. It took him 3 years. Not just 3 years, but he had to be in prison in Caesarea for 2 years, which is the second trial, and then the third trial. And after his third trial, he is on a boat headed to Rome to face Nero, who was the Caesar at the time. And guess what happens? There's a shipwreck. Not just that, but he survives and gets bitten by a poisonous snake. This is the life of the Apostle Paul, who we also know from history was executed in 64 AD. So, Paul, he is speaking before Agrippa. Who is Agrippa? Agrippa was the grandson of Herod. Remember Herod during the life of Christ, how Christ and his family had to leave Jerusalem and go to Egypt because Herod thought he was the king of the Jews and he wanted to kill Christ. Well, there was Herod, and he passed away, and then there was Agrippa, who is his son, and he was the one in Acts chapter 12 who says, "The voice of a God, not a man, the voice of a God, not a man," and God killed him, and worms ate him. He was also the one that executed James, and his son was Agrippa II, who Paul is appearing before here in Caesarea. And he says this in Acts chapter 26, verse 1. So Agrippa, the grandson of Herod the Great, said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." Then Paul stretched out his hand and made his defense. Now, what kind of defense will Paul make? From verse 4 all the way to verse 8, what Paul does is he communicates, this is how my life was before. This is how my life was before. And he says this, "Then they'd known me for a long time if they were willing to testify that according to the strictest party of our religion, I have lived as what? A Pharisee." Paul communicates from verse 4 to 8 who he was before. Who was he? He was a Pharisee. What did he do as a Pharisee? From verse 9 to 11, Paul says he was a persecutor of the Christians. He says in verse 11, "And I punished them often in all the synagogues and tried to make them blaspheme." And he says, "And in ragey fury against them, I persecuted them, even to foreign cities." So, Paul, who was he before? He was a Pharisee, a strict Pharisee, one that was zealous, one that was in raging fury, anger, passionate to kill those who were Christians because he thought they were blasphemers. Okay? So, what we can see here from the Apostle Paul is what kind of defense is he giving? It's a personal defense. It's a testimonial defense. It's not just some abstract understanding of Christianity. This is his own life that is completely changed. He's a testimony before Agrippa. Okay? Now, Paul is a testimony of change. And he's before the courts. And when it comes to the nature of change, there's two forms of changes that happen that we as people think that happens. First, there is a type of change that happens where your identity is based upon your image. So you could be a person that maybe has 5 different types of identities, or you present yourself in 5 different ways, and you think that's truly you, but it's really not. And what life does, what suffering does, is it breaks these false images of ourselves to the point that there's the real us. And as time goes by, say 20 years, people might look at you and be like, man, you're a changed person. Question, are you a changed person, or are you just who you were always, but you were just hiding it behind these different images of yourself? This is what the nature of suffering does, which happens to all of us. But there's a second nature of change, and that is this. You are truly one way. You are truly one way, such as the Apostle Paul, as you are zealous against those who are of the Christian faith. And all of a sudden, there's a radical change to where you are no longer like that. That's a good form of change. And that is a change that the Apostle Paul is experiencing, and he communicates, he testifies before Agrippa that he is a new creation in Christ, a completely different person, which is what we all should strive for. Now, the second defense that Paul gives is that of an existential defense. From verse 12 all the way to verse 18, what Paul does is he communicates how his life changed. And he pretty much reiterates Acts chapter 9, the road to Damascus, as Christ appears to him as he's on the road to Damascus, and he has this experience of a life-changing event where Paul completely changes. And he says this in verse 14, "And when he had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads.'" Now, this phrase, "it is hard for you to kick against the goads," is an ancient saying from a Greek poet named Pindar. And Pindar, this is 500 years before this event happened, says this: "To bear lightly the neck's yokes brings strength, but kicking against the goads is a way of failure." A goad was pretty much used to direct ox. If you notice in the book of Judges, there was a guy by the name of Shamgar who kills 600 people with an ox goad, and it was pretty much a stick with a prick at the side of it. So, say a shepherd for ox would poke an ox, and the ox would get annoyed and would kick, and as the ox kicked, it would get scraped by the prick. So the ox would realize that it is better to heed, to follow the direction of the shepherd versus kicking, following my own way, following its own way, and as a result, getting hurt. And this is true with all of us. As humans, we are in this world, created by God, but there is a set order, a set way that God has created for us for our good. And we have a choice. We can follow the direction of the shepherd and be in a healthy state, or we can kick against the goads and as a result experience some form of pain, some form of suffering, which Paul was experiencing. Now, every single one of us is born into this world, and when we're born into this world, we believe something from Genesis chapter 3, that we shall be like God. That is, that there is a will, there is a power struggle, there is a control struggle in each and every single one of us. Just look at a baby when it's born. Always willing something, always wanting control. You take a toy out of its hand, it's going to cry. There's a will within each and every single one of us. And I believe the role of a parent, the role of what life does, is it breaks that will. It breaks our control. Think of it. You shall be like God from Genesis chapter 3. Well, there's 8 billion people on this planet. How can one person rule as God? Well, if this world is if I can't God this world, well, guess what? It'll be this space. It'll be this room. It might be a job, and it'll be expressed in different ways. This is why sometimes success within a person, and that's all they get in life, that's all they experience, is not necessarily healthy. Because sometimes what that does is it strengthens your will. It strengthens your control. It strengthens your power. Where what God wants to do is the exact opposite. From a baby all the way to adulthood, one of the key facets of life is to ungod a person. And that is break their control, break their power struggles, break their wills to the point of submission to that of, I am not God, someone else is God other than me. And this is called death to self, what Christ calls. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Abolition of Man, calls it the Tao. And what he says is there's pretty much a set way of how each and every single one of us live that is ordained by God, okay? But if we stray away from these principles that God has given us, we experience some form of suffering, some form of internal strife, right? The church father, St. Augustine, once called it disordered desires. That is, that within our heart, there is a disordered state, and what we need to do is reorder these things in our lives. And as we reorder them, we fall into alignment with God, therefore experiencing what God calls human flourishing, a healthy state of the soul. But when we strive away from these things, we experience some form of mental bondage within us. Our desires take over, and all of a sudden, there's an internal suffering that happens. This is what Paul calls kicking against the goads. But to be free, we must listen and submit to that of the shepherd. The third defense that Paul will give is that of a rational defense. A rational defense. From verse 19 all the way to verse 25, Paul is communicating now the new gospel message that has changed his life. And as he's communicating the gospel, he's before Festus and he's before Agrippa. So remember, Agrippa was the grandson of Herod, and they were the regional kings at the time of Judea. But Rome also had their governors spread out throughout Rome. And remember, the governor at the time of Christ was Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate ruled for 10 years, and after him, we have here in Acts chapter 26 a different one. Before was Felix, and now what we have is Festus. Festus was the governor of Rome at the time, overseeing and working with Agrippa. And he says this in verse 24, and as he was saying these things in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. And Paul says, I'm not on my mind, most excellent Festus, for I'm speaking truth and rational words. Truth and rational words. The gospel, the Christian faith made sense to Paul personally, as he is a personal testimony, a witness. He has a personal defense, as Agrippa and Bernice and Festus see Paul. There's also an existential defense that Paul gives, but also it's a rational defense. It's not just subjective; it's also objective. Christianity, it makes sense rationally. Why does it make sense rationally? There's something called the resurrection of Jesus Christ that completely changed the first century of Rome, of Judea at the time. And how do we know the resurrection happened? Well, there are plausible reasons how we know why, okay? First is the death of Jesus of Nazareth, the first century figure, Jesus of Nazareth. It's incredible. We know the exact date when he died, April 3rd. He was put on the cross at 9 a.m. and died at 3 p.m. And it took 7 hours for him to be on the cross and died. Typically, it would take 9 days for a victim to die on the cross. Well, why did it take 7 hours for Jesus to die on the cross? Well, because they beat him up that badly. But again, we know exactly when the first century figure of Jesus of Nazareth was put on the cross and died. And he died. Not only does the New Testament affirm that, but also secular. First and second century historians document the first century figure of Jesus of Nazareth just dying. Okay, you have Josephus, we have Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman official at the time, confirming Jesus of Nazareth just died on the cross. Now, he died, okay, and also Rome. We know that Romans were good at executing. We're good at killing people. The second is this: there was an empty tomb. There was an empty tomb, and it was reported that women were the first to appear before the empty tomb. Well, why is that significant? Is because if this was just made up, if the disciples said, let's just lie and fabricate an idea that Jesus, his tomb was empty and he resurrected from the dead, why women? Because in the first century culture, people would not listen to that if there were women speaking. Well, why does he say women? Because this is what happened. It's an authentic message. Okay, so we have a dead Christ, we have an empty tomb. Third, we have the belief of the apostles, eyewitnesses. There's a document in First Corinthians chapter 15, really early, that says that more than 500 people appeared to him. Now, hallucinations happen. You can see things, you can see mirages, but that's only one person seeing a hallucination. 2 people, 3 people, 500 people seeing the exact person. This is why the emphasis of the New Testament, we saw him, we saw him, we saw him, we touched him, right? It's plausible. It gives evidence as far as, 500 people saw the resurrected Christ, the eyewitnesses, and fourth, the conversion of the Apostle Paul. It's psychologically confusing as far as why Paul, who had everything at the time, he had his education, he had prestige, he was a Roman citizen, he was a Benjamite, why would he convert to Christianity when he was the one persecuting Christians? This is like Richard Dawkins, all of a sudden becoming a Christian, not just becoming a Christian, but becoming a zealous Christian. Well, these are things that happen in the first century that shows evidence to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, to show that, Paul's defense, it's not just I feel it, it's I know it, and it's rational. Paul gives a rational defense of the gospel. Now, the fourth defense that Paul gives is a biblical defense. In verse 26 and 27 says, For the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly. For I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice. For this has not been done in a corner. And he says in verse 27, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you believe. Remember, King Agrippa, the Herodian dynasty, remember from Herod to Agrippa II, they were Edomites, and what that means is they were partially Jews, but they weren't fully Jews. What that means is, and by implication, is they knew the Jewish culture well enough, but they weren't as Jewish enough to fully embrace Judaism. So they had a knowledge of it. This is why there was a co-rulership between the governors of Rome and that of the Herodian dynasty. So that when Paul is saying, I know you know, meaning that he knows the Old Testament. Now, within the Old Testament, there are more than 300 prophecies of Christ and how Christ fulfilled them. There's a passage in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 7 that says this, Who is like me? Let him proclaim it. Let him declare and set it before me. Since I appointed an ancient people, let them declare what is to come and what will happen. So God is saying, if you know that you're the true God, if you believe that you're the true God, because a lot of people are claiming that they're God, or believing that they're God, what does the future hold? And can you fulfill them? Could you know them? We see this in the New Testament. We see the Old Testament as fulfilled prophecy. I'm not talking about fulfilled prophecy as far as the future from today in 2024. I'm talking about prophecy that has been fulfilled in the Old Testament. For example, Isaiah 44 and 45 talks about a prophecy of a guy by the name of Cyrus. Cyrus, which was fulfilled in the book of Daniel, chapter 5. Cyrus was Cyrus the Great, who was the Persian ruler who liberated the Jews. And he was a real person. History attests that Cyrus the Great, we know it's from the Cyrus cylinder, but it is amazing, it is fascinating that the book of Isaiah, chapter 44, 45, prophesies, calls him by name, and it is fulfilled in the book of Daniel 200 years later. Okay? The odds of that are unbelievable. No different from that of Jesus Christ, as far as when Paul says to Agrippa, I know you know these things, as far as Christ fulfilled certain prophecies, more than 300. There was a study done by a guy by the name of Peter W. Stoner, who was the chairman of the Department of Mathematics and Astronomy of Pasadena City College, and he came up with a study saying the odds of one person fulfilling just 8 prophecies, not 300, 8 prophecies, are 1 in 100 quadrillion. Okay, 1 in 100 quadrillion. That's 17 zeros at the end of it. The odds of one person fulfilling just 8 prophecies. Well, guess what? Christ fulfilled them. Just 8. Okay? So when he says to Agrippa, I know you know these things, meaning it's a biblical defense too. It's consistent. The person of Christ resurrecting from the dead is consistent with the scriptures. What Paul communicates here is a biblical defense. The fifth defense that Paul gives is that of a selfless defense. A selfless defense. In verse 20 and 29 it says, "And Agrippa said to Paul, 'In short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian?' And Paul says, 'Whether short or long, I would to God that only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains.'" What we have is Agrippa. Paul's before Agrippa, before Bernice, that's his sister, and Festus. And Agrippa's like, wait, you're trying to persuade me to be a follower of the way, a follower of Christianity? Paul's like, oh yeah, right? Remember, what's the context here? Paul is on trial for his own life. Remember Caesar? Live, or die. It's pretty much he's at this position of life as far as defending his livelihood. Remember, Nero is Caesar at the time, and we know Nero is known for killing Christians. Now, Paul doesn't defend himself, but uses this opportunity, as he's in Caesarea, before Agrippa, before Festus, before Bernice, before the rulers of Judea, to preach the message of the gospel. And that's what he does. And the reason why it's a selfless defense is because Paul is not defending himself. He's more concerned about other people. Okay? The liberty of self through selfless motives. There's a liberty within that persists in every single one of us when we're selfless inside. And I mean truly selfless. You know this by how you respond to things, by how you act. If selfishness persists inside of you, then there's a bondage that exists. Liberty exists where selfishness dwells. Bondage exists where selfishness dwells. If you're selfless, there's a liberty that happens. You want to know the true way to be free of such something called mental health? Well, it's to really die to self. To the opposite, as far as one being in bondage, one always struggling with their own personal desires, is because it's alive. It persists within them. And Paul, remember, he is not defending himself. He is using the opportunity to preach the message of the gospel. And this shows an example of one that is truly dead to themselves. And if you're dead to yourself, then you're free. You are truly a free person. Paul says, I am crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who lives, but that Christ that lives in me. Is Paul just speaking? No, he's living it out. And as he's living it out, guess what? There is internal liberty. Internal liberty. One of the reasons why you see in our generation, the 21st century, one thing that always persists within our generation is mental health. Mental health. Mental health, you hear people. And what that implies is bondage from within. It's an internal struggle. Well, what that implies is a self that has not been put to death. St. Augustine, in his time in the 3rd and 4th century, was alive during the collapse of the Roman Empire. And you notice, there's a lot of unhappy people in my generation. And you know what St. Augustine says? The very essence of what this is people have a disordered state within them. I know I mentioned this in point 2, but they have a disordered state within them. That is, that they're loving things that are less important versus loving things of primary value. They love themselves too much. And when you love yourself too much, guess what happens? There's bondage. Paul is an utterly free man. When I say free, he's in chains, but internally he's free. Why? Because these things in life, they don't rule his heart. He doesn't pursue them. He's not in a state of worship before these things, giving his heart to these things. Now, Paul, as he's before them, he's not only dead to his own personal desires, but remember, his own life. We as people, we naturally defend our image. We defend the things that we love. You know what? The most important thing that we'll defend is our own lives. We defend our own lives if our lives are at stake. Paul doesn't just defend his own life, but remember, his livelihood is at stake here, and he's completely free of that in the sense that, sure, To be with Christ is gain, but he is here on earth to preach the gospel, what we know in Philippians chapter 1. And this part right here in Acts chapter 26 is a testament that Paul is a liberated person. He's selfless. It's a selfless defense that he gives. He doesn't defend his life because he's over it. He's dead. And as a result, he's a liberated man, which we can all attain to if we learn how to die to self. After Acts chapter 26, Paul is then put on a ship and sent to Rome, where there is going to be a shipwreck and he will get bitten by a poisonous snake, but he'll eventually make it to Rome. But what can we learn from Acts chapter 26? Well, a holistic defense. We went through Paul's personal defense, that he is a witness. His life is a testimony of being a Pharisee to killing Christians to being now a completely transformed person. He is a truly changed person, a personal defense. Second, there's an existential defense that Paul gives. He was kicking against the goads before, meaning when he walks away from the standards, when he walks away from the path of God, he experiences some form of pricking in his heart. Well, that's bondage, and Paul liberated himself through the gospel. That's an existential defense. Third, it was a rational defense that Paul gave. It wasn't just subjective. It wasn't just based upon, I'm free from within. It's like, no, this makes logical, rational sense. The resurrection of Jesus Christ. People saw him. And fourth, Paul gives a biblical defense as far as the prophecies that were communicated about the future Messiah. Christ fulfilled these prophecies. And fifth, Paul gives a selfless defense. Remember, Paul is on trial for his life. And he doesn't even defend himself. He gives a testimony of how Christ saved him and how he's a true person. And he points to Agrippa. He points to Festus. And he communicates this gospel to them because he's concerned about their lives and their spiritual well-being versus his own life. It's a selfless defense. If we were on trial and our lives were on the line, of course, it's human nature. We defend our own lives. Paul was over it. Why? Because he was dead to self. He gave a holistic defense. In order to truly win in this life, you need to lose to yourself. And that brings the greatest freedom, which was what Christ says. In order to live, you must die to yourself and therefore experience the kingdom of God. Paul here gives a holistic defense of the Christian gospel.
Join us as we take the good news of Jesus Christ to every nation. Now is the time to give to your local church and support your pastor. Every donation you give goes to supporting your church. Your giving helps us reach more people for Christ as we start new daily churches together. Thank you for your support. God bless.